Okay, so evolution. First, I'm going to go through the history behind evolution, and my goal with this presentation is to go through basically all of the beliefs of time, the things that we covered, the beliefs that have formed up to, well, basically about now, about creation and how it was formed and how we have evolved and adapted, etc. And I want to look at those different beliefs and point out that each of them have something interesting and possibly valid, but ultimately we need to look at the world sacramentally and understand what that means in order to understand what evolution possibly and really is and what creation really is. All right, so we started our discussion of evolution talking about special creation. So special creation is the belief that was generally held and believed throughout society up until the 1800s. It's the belief that each individual was specifically created by God. It has a very strong basis in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, it strictly believes that creation was in 6 days and that everything that we need to exist in this world was given within those 6 days. So not only do we need to evolve, but we are enabled to evolve and adapt. Everything that we have is given. We don't need to change it all. So this was the basic view of creation up to the 1800s. All right, so I was wondering what came after this. Is this just what was generally believed up until Darwin? Was there anything else? And I found out, I discovered another theory called progressive creation, which came about in the 1800s. And this began with the discovery of certain fossils. So people were finding out that fossils from 1,000 years ago looked different than a fossil that one might find from 300 years ago. And they were thinking, well, if nothing has needed to evolve or adapt over time, why aren't these fossils looking familiar? Why are these fossils extinct now? Why can't we find anything in creation that looks like this now? So this kind of made people change their minds about the theory of special creation. So they came up with this thing called progressive creation, which is the belief that new life forms over time. So I was a little confused about what this meant. Did it just mean that all of a sudden there's new life? And essentially, yes, that's what this belief holds, that creation is brought forth in quote unquote rapid bursts, that creation appears suddenly, that this creation can last for millions of years and suddenly this creation starts dying out. And as that creation starts dying out, new life is brought forth in yet another rapid burst. So there was this interesting quote I found to explain progressive creation, and it says, "These bursts represent instances of God creating new types of organisms by divine intervention." So that led me to think this view of creation essentially says that we're good for however many years, in this case, periods of millions of years, until all of a sudden we start dying out, and then God decides to come in and bring new life forth. So from that perspective, it's leading me to believe that God is not believed to be a constant in this universe. He's believed to be someone who intervenes when he deems it necessary. So when life is dying, he sees as he sees fit. He also sees fit to bring forth new life in creation. So species, through this theory, it is believed that species do not change. They have new forms that just appear over time, and these forms appear fully formed. They do not need to develop. As one species dies, another is just instantly introduced, fully formed. So special creation and progressive creation were some of the basic beliefs up until the age of Darwinism. Okay, so next slide. So we get up to 1859 where we introduce Darwin and his book, The Origin of Species, and ultimately his theory of evolution. So Charles Darwin, he essentially just introduced an entirely new outlook on creation. As we talked about in class, his studies began after observing the breeding of dogs, and it was through these observations that he noticed what he called natural selection and variation, which is Darwin's phrasing for what we also can call descent with modification, meaning he was noticing that there are change in traits from generation to generation. So, Darwin published his thoughts and theories and ideas into his book, The Origin of Species, where he introduced and explained his idea of natural selection, which means that natural selection, obviously, it takes place naturally. And as we know, natural means intentional, it happens over time. But Darwin also believed that natural selection was this random adaptation that happened. So traits were just randomly given to generation after generation, and they would just adapt in the wild. So it just depended on where you were living, maybe how strong you were, how much food you have. Your outside conditions basically determined if you would survive or not, and that's his view on adaptation and evolution. And then he juxtaposed natural selection to artificial selection, which is the change produced by man, which is a good example of that is the dog breeding that he was studying. So we have natural selection versus artificial selection. Okay, next slide. So Darwin's theory, it left some questions because Darwin was claiming that natural selection is something that just happens. The passing on of traits is pretty much random, and it depends on totally outside conditions, the exterior conditions, the conditions around you. But this left some questions, including why doesn't the interbreeding eliminate all variation in a species, and is it true that natural selection, as random as Darwin claims, does follow a specific path of rules? Because Darwin saw natural selection as a rule. In this next slide, delving deeper into evolution, I explain what pangenesis is, and pangenesis is something I found that was a theory created by Darwin. Pangenesis is the idea that a new generation inherits particles from all parts of the parent, meaning that everything that a parent has is passed into the next generation, and it's visible, and they essentially have to have it, and it has to be visible. But if that's true, that still doesn't answer the question, why is there variation in a species? Why does the breeding of these two dogs make their one of their kids, so to speak, have spots and the other one doesn't? So this is where Gregor Mendel came in, and Father Mendel was able to disprove pangenesis, as I'm sure everyone's familiar with his studies of breeding the pea pods in different plants to see what the outcomes were. And what Father Mendel discovered was that genetics do not always follow strict and absolute rules. There is an element of chance, which we can call chance mutation, which is essentially what Father Mendel discovered. Okay, next slide. So Father Mendel came to conclusions on genetics, and they can be narrowed down into 3 rules. All right, number 1, traits are determined by units that are passed on to descendants unchanged. We now call these units genes, but Father did not know at the time, they were not named that, but now we can call these units genes. Number 2, an individual inherits a gene from each parent for each trait. And number 3, a trait may not be apparent in an individual, but they are still able to pass that trait down to the next generation. So I printed off this little this picture that shows the parent generation, in this case, the beige and the green. And in the next generation, you can see that this generation only displays the traits of one parent, but that does not mean that they do not have traits of both parents, as shown through the second generation, which has a trait from the green parent. So this discovery is important because it shows that traits that are displayed can be skipped a generation or even two generations, etc., but that does not mean that they do not have them. Each generation holds that trait, and there is an element of chance that you may not display that trait. Okay, so next slide. I believe his name is pronounced Ernst Haeckel, and we spoke a little bit about him in class, and I just wanted to make sure I understood, so I looked up some more things about him. Basically just his philosophy, which we went over in class. Haeckel believed that all species evolve from one parent entity, and he called this belief the vital molecular movement, meaning there's some kind of molecule, let's say, that is in every single species, and it was given to us from a parent entity. So I also copied this picture, which I believe Haeckel wrote out and drew himself. So it kind of shows his thought process and his belief that from a very, very, very small organism, we finally can get to the age of man. So it shows the process of the age of fishes and the age of reptiles and mammals until we get to the age of man. So he believes that everything came from one parent entity, which is just kind of weird that he thinks that. It's definitely pretty different from what Darwin and Mendel were working towards. So that's just another view of evolution that's come over time. Okay, next slide. So we've talked about each of these things. So here's the review: special creation, that everything was specifically created and adaptation to the wild is not needed because we're given everything that we need to survive. Until fossils were found, and then progressive creation became a more popular idea, that God inserts new life forms over time as he sees fit. So as one population dies out, he inserts a new life form into the universe. And then came Darwin and his theory of evolution, that creation adapts through natural selection, but these adaptations are pretty random. To Darwin, natural selection was intentional, but yet there was still that idea that there was something random behind it. So then Father Mendel introduced that there's still this element of being random because genetics do not follow a strict and absolute rule. There's always that element of chance. And then there's Haeckel saying that all of creation has the same parent, that the world comes from one same material source, one material entity. So it's been my hope that in reviewing these things, you're kind of noticing that each of these ideas, possibly not Haeckel's, I don't really think there's anything much that you can glean from that, but all these other ideas are kind of heading in a direction that we want to complete. Each of these things has something that we can take as valid and a good point, and ultimately we want to get to one conclusion. How do we form a true understanding of what creation is? What's our role in this creation? And have we really evolved? Are we really just here randomly? Is natural selection just really about survival of the fittest? And we're just here and we're fated, because that's essentially what Darwin was saying. Okay, so as I just said, this next slide says, where do humans really belong in the process of creation? So we reviewed all these different types of creation. What is our role in these beliefs, and what's actually the thing that we need to follow when we're thinking about creation? So all of this leads us to the sacramental view. The sacramental view of creation of our part in creation, how we evolve over time, how we actually adapt, what is our role in adaptation, etc., etc. And the sacramental worldview says that the body and the soul complement one another. So the human soul, obviously, the church has said this, and this is pretty straightforward. The human soul cannot come from a biological process. Thus, the human soul is not a part of this world. But we can also agree, and we can also say that the human body can evolve over time. We get used to certain things, we adapt. The best example that I can think of is how over time we don't need all of our teeth, like we have our wisdom teeth removed. We don't need all of those teeth because we've learned how to cook our meat, and we don't need as strong teeth because we don't eat raw meat now, etc., etc. So we've adapted over time and we've changed. Okay, so I'd just like to point out some things. So my next slide is called Why Darwin's Theory is Wrong. Darwin's theory is incomplete, and he sees the world as some kind of intentional yet random design. So intentional meaning that it's survival of the fittest, that everything is fated and there's really no choice. But these adaptations are just kind of randomly based on the exterior around you. So you really have no choice in what happens. It just kind of, whatever happens goes, and you just kind of have to run with it, that kind of idea. And I looked up some theories and ideas as to why Darwin's theory is wrong. And the best one that I found, and the one that I found really interesting, was something called irreducible complexity. And a good way to explain this for humanities class right now is thinking to anthropic coincidence. Basically, there's so much in the universe that is so specific and so detailed. There's no way it's random, and there's no way that it's just a random placement. For instance, DNA you could never base DNA in Darwin's theory that it's randomly adapted and it's randomly evolved. There's no way that DNA could just be so specific and so precise to each human being. There's no way that something like that could just evolve over time. It had to have a specific plan, a specific order. It could not be formed randomly, but it could also not be formed through this idea of survival of the fittest, because there is a specific plan and a specific process. And also, just the idea of natural selection. It's intentional yet random, which is essentially what Darwin is saying, but that's paradoxical. You cannot follow absolute rules, but also have a random combination. All right, and then we also need to talk about genetics and evolution, because obviously, as spoken about with Father Mendel's discoveries, there is that element of chance. And the question that Mr. Miller asked in class was, is the element of chance consistent with a providentially designed universe? Chance, which we defined as a meeting of events not brought about by pre-existing laws / established causes. So can chance really work in a world where God designed things specifically for us? And thinking back to like DNA is so specific. Is there really an element of chance? And how do we equate that in this world without being heretical or without giving into Darwin's theory that things are pretty random? All of this discussion leads me to the final point that we need to have a sacramental worldview. In the sacramental worldview, we do not see changes as chance, but rather as secondary causes. Secondary causes are essentially us. They are how we change and adapt in the universe. It's really just our discovery of changes in the universe, such as the discovery of the change of fossils over time. So, can change really occur in a world where God has created order and purpose? Yes, God wills these secondary causes. Why does God will the secondary causes? It's because He wants us to adapt and grow and learn from creation. God has a specific plan, but He also wills secondary causes because He wants man to discover this plan with Him. He wants us along for the ride. He doesn't, I kind of think of it as God's at the wheel, but we're also in the vehicle with Him, moving and looking at things. So God's taking us to a place, to a direction, but He wants us there with Him along the journey. And this also means that we believe in both the body and the soul. We need both to exist. We recognize that our bodies change, but we also recognize that our soul is there too. So Haeckel's theory that everything comes from a material entity is a very narrow-minded view. We need both to exist. We develop our creativity in the material world, which is a good thing. God wants us to change and grow with the material world. Our souls, our outlet for our souls in this world is creativity on the earth. And finally, for my final slide, God and man together. Creation is not just God alone, and it's not man alone, which goes back to the idea of the sacramental worldview, body and soul. Man is called to co-create with God. He's called to play an active role in creation. He's called to constantly learn and grow in this world. God's given us the tools and we have to learn to use them. These are secondary causes which God wills. He wants us to join with Him. He wants us to create and learn with Him. That's why we can discover all of these things and get closer and closer to Him in these discoveries.